Hello, glad to see you on the channel. Subscribe, give a like, and don't forget to leave a comment. Enjoy watching.
You're fired, John. I swear he didn't even look up from his stupid 1500 Herman Miller chair when he said it. Just sat there like he was about to order a latte instead of gutting a guy who'd given more to this company than his entire family combined. Then came the kicker. It's not personal, it's just, family first, you know? And he actually grinned. That polished, cologne-soaked, born-rich grin that made you want to punch a tennis racket. As if family first was a logical business policy. As if firing the operations manager of 22 years could be chalked up to a heart-warming Disney slogan. I didn't argue. I didn't shout. I didn't flip the table or say something clever about karma or lawyers or how someday he'd need someone like me again. I just stood up, buttoned my jacket like a guy leaving a bad wedding, and said, "All right." And that's the part that really got him, I think, because Ryan Caldwell had been waiting to do this for years. Ever since his dad, Harold, used to call me his right hand in meetings. Ryan couldn't stand it. He hated that I'd been there before him, that I knew the real numbers behind the pretty PowerPoints, that when his dad needed something done, he came to me, not to his son with the MBA from some overpriced diploma factory. He finally had the crown now. Daddy stepped back and made him interim CEO 6 months ago. Interim, yeah, but he had the power, and that's all that mattered to him. Power, and getting rid of people who reminded everyone who used to actually run things around here. I knew this moment was coming the second Harold started missing Monday huddles. He didn't say much about why, some quiet talk of slowing down, maybe traveling with Margaret, but you could tell something was off. The man had lived for this company, built it from scratch in the 90s, back when we were stuffing shipping boxes in a garage and praying the HVAC would last another month. Guys like him don't just take a vacation, not without a reason. Ryan saw an opening and took it. And now here I was, standing in front of his oversized glass desk, a folder of my own performance reports in hand, all of them stellar, mind you, while he tried not to smirk too obviously. "Do you want to take your things today, or should we have someone pack them up?" he asked, like he was offering me fries with that. I told him I'd pack them up myself, slowly, carefully. Hell, I'd probably use that time to say goodbye to the folks I actually cared about, the ones still trying to keep this ship from sinking while Ryan played boss. I walked out of his office and made my way down the hall. And I'll tell you something strange. I wasn't angry. Don't get me wrong, I was humiliated. I'd given 2 decades of my life to that place. Missed birthdays, missed anniversaries, sat through conference calls on Thanksgiving morning, and rewrote logistics manuals while my wife watched It's a Wonderful Life alone in the next room. I worked through the flu, through layoffs, through some very public blow-ups between the sales VP and one of the junior reps. I trained half of the current leadership team. Hell, I was the guy who built the vendor system they still use today. And now I was being tossed like an empty stapler because Junior wanted to make a point. But I wasn't mad. Not really. Because I remembered something Ryan didn't. Or maybe he never even knew, which was worse. See, 5 years ago, Harold and I had this late night in the office. Just the two of us, everyone else gone home. He was pacing like he used to when he was deep in thought, muttering about succession planning and what happens when he eventually hands over the keys. He asked if I ever thought about taking a board seat. I told him I wasn't the tie and cufflinks type. I liked working in the guts of the place. Ops, logistics, problem solving, not golfing and handshakes, but he appreciated the honesty. And that night, between bites of cold pizza and sips of that awful machine coffee, we drafted a clause. A little thing buried deep in the company bylaws. Not flashy, not headline-worthy, just one quiet section that said something along the lines of, in the event that a family member is promoted to an executive leadership role, the founder retains the right to appoint an operational consultant with oversight privileges should said family leadership prove detrimental to the company's interests. No one ever talked about it. Harold signed it. The board approved it in one of those rubber stamp meetings where everyone just wants to get to lunch. And then it sat there, collecting metaphorical dust. Until now. I didn't invoke it then, not in Ryan's office. I didn't need to give him the satisfaction of a fight. He wanted me out because I reminded him of his father's trust in me, and that's something he could never earn with title alone. No. I let him win this round, let him feel big, let him feel powerful, let him bask in the glory of finally cutting down the old tree in the yard, because what he didn't know, what he never bothered to read, is that the roots of that tree were still under his house. And come storm season? Well, let's just say I had a feeling he'd learn the hard way. So let me ask you, if a boss's brat blindsided you like that, would you walk away quietly? Or would you wait, smile, and remind them who planted the foundation they're now trying to piss on? I didn't start working at Caldwell and Chase because I had dreams of becoming someone's right hand. Back then, I was just another guy in his 30s, already burned out from 2 previous jobs where the bosses got bonuses while I got carpal tunnel. When I met Harold Caldwell, he wasn't Mr. Caldwell or founder and CEO. He was just Harold, standing on a concrete warehouse floor in dusty boots, scribbling notes on a clipboard while trying to figure out how to ship 2,000 orders with a team of 7 and a forklift that leaked more than it lifted. He asked me if I could fix things. I said I could try. That was the job interview. Over the years, we built something that, while never flashy, was real. We didn't go viral, we didn't disrupt any industries, and we sure as hell weren't trending on LinkedIn. But we made a company that worked. The kind of place where people stayed for 10, 15, even 20 years because it paid decent, promoted from within, and mostly left you alone to do your job. We made mistakes, a hell of a lot of them, especially in those early days, but we fixed what we broke. We learned, we evolved, not overnight, but piece by piece. That company, the one I helped build with Harold, doesn't exist anymore. It started changing the day Harold brought his son Ryan in as Director of Innovation, which is corporate code for Dad made a job for me. Ryan was 26, fresh off a graduate program that cost more than my first house, and he walked into the office like he was there to save us from ourselves. He wore suits that didn't fit and cologne that was trying too hard, and he asked questions during meetings that made you realize he hadn't read a single quarterly report. But the worst part wasn't his ignorance, it was his pride in it. He didn't want to know how things worked. He wanted us to be dazzled by how well he could talk around the fact that he didn't. Still, I tried to be patient. I'd seen worse. You spend 20 years in operations, you learn to adapt to all kinds of personalities. The screamer, the ghoster, the micromanager, the idea guy who never finishes anything. Ryan was just another archetype. The heir who thought the company was a family business in the royal sense of the word. I figured he'd get bored or mess up badly enough that Harold would quietly shuffle him into some side project. That was the unspoken plan, I think. Let him burn out at the top without giving him any actual levers to pull. But Harold got sick. He never made a big announcement about it. No speech, no company-wide email. He just started missing more meetings, delegating more decisions, and eventually pulling me aside to say, "You're going to have to keep this place running for a little while." At the time, I thought a little while meant a few months. It turned into years. Ryan moved up during that time, mostly because no one else wanted the visibility and Harold wasn't around to block it. By the time the board made him interim CEO, most of the old guard had either retired, been pushed out, or figured it wasn't worth fighting anymore. He liked to say things like, "We're modernizing," and "it's time to let go of legacy systems," which, loosely translated, meant gutting anything he didn't understand. He got rid of our in-house support team because some consultant told him outsourcing to a cheaper vendor in Indiana would save costs, until our average client response time tripled. He cut the bonus structure for mid-level managers and replaced it with a convoluted performance incentive model that no one could decode. He even tried to rename the company Caldwell Strategic, but backed off after someone pointed out that it sounded like a bad insurance firm. And through it all, I kept showing up. Not because I liked the direction things were heading, but because I still felt responsible for the people who worked there. They weren't just names on a spreadsheet to me. They were the folks I had coffee with every morning, the ones who remembered my kids' names, the ones who pulled 12-hour shifts with me when a shipment went sideways. People like Lisa in procurement, who held the entire vendor network together with little more than duct tape and willpower. Or Kevin from IT, who could fix a printer while talking you through your divorce. I'd built a life here, not just a career. So even as Ryan stumbled around pretending he was the next Elon Musk, I did my job. I kept operations running, solved problems he didn't know existed, and took hits from clients when his decisions backfired. And still, the writing was on the wall. Once Harold fully stepped back, I knew I was on borrowed time. Ryan didn't want anyone in the room who could remember what the place used to be, especially not someone who still had the staff's respect. The day he fired me, he thought he was erasing a threat. What he didn't realize, or maybe just never cared enough to learn, was that his father and I had already discussed this scenario. Long before Ryan had any real power, Harold had warned me that handing over the reins to his son might not be the fairy tale ending he wanted. "He's smart, but he doesn't listen," he had said one night after a brutal quarterly review. "He doesn't know how to treat people who aren't impressed by him." So we came up with a contingency, a quiet one, not something we talked about in front of others, just a little clause tucked into the corporate bylaws with enough legal weight to pull the brakes if things ever got out of control. Ryan never asked to see those bylaws. He was too busy redesigning the lobby and installing a meditation room that no one used. He thought being CEO meant he had inherited the soul of the company. But that wasn't in the will. The soul of the company was something different, something earned. And I was still carrying it, even as I walked out with my cardboard box and half-used notepad. Ryan had won a battle, but he didn't realize that the war hadn't even started yet, and I wasn't the only one who still had skin in the game. The first few days after I got fired were quieter than I expected. No calls, no emails, no fallout. I thought maybe someone from the board would reach out, ask a few questions, pretend to be surprised, maybe even offer one of those phony "thank you for your years of service" gestures. But nothing came. Just silence. Like I'd been erased. And maybe that's exactly what Ryan thought he'd done. Clean sweep, no witnesses, no mess. He didn't understand that old companies have long shadows, and mine was still stretching across the halls he was now pretending to command. I spent the first morning walking the dog and drinking coffee that didn't taste like it came from a break room pot last cleaned during Obama's first term. I tried to enjoy it. I really did. But I've been wired for motion too long. I can't sit still with my hands empty. So sometime around the second afternoon, I found myself back in my home office, staring at the same filing cabinet I hadn't opened in years. And that's when I remembered the clause. It wasn't a sudden lightning bolt, more like a slow crawl of memory, the way your mind brings back an old face you didn't know you remembered. The clause had come up during one of those late-night talks with Harold, the kind of conversation you only have after 20 years of trench work beside a man who bled for his business. It wasn't something he scribbled on a cocktail napkin or added impulsively after a board retreat. No, this was a calculated move, baked into a series of structural revisions we'd made after a particularly ugly quarter when a junior VP tried to push through unauthorized vendor contracts that almost got us sued into oblivion. Harold had asked me point blank, "What do you think happens if someone inherits this place who doesn't know what the hell they're owning?" And I told him, "Then you better leave behind something that keeps the engine running while they figure it out, or until someone smarter takes the wheel." The clause was our answer. It wasn't even a full page long. Nestled right there in the second volume of the operating bylaws, under the subhead titled Emergency Oversight Appointments, sat Section 7.3.4. It stated in black and white legalese that if an immediate family member of the founder assumed an executive leadership role, the founder retained the right, during his tenure as majority stakeholder, to appoint a special operational consultant whose observations, when submitted to the board with sufficient documentation, could trigger a leadership performance review within 14 business days. Now, Harold was no longer in day-to-day operations, but I knew he still held the largest single chunk of shares. That meant that while he might not have been showing up at the office every morning, his pen still mattered, and the clause still had teeth. Small, maybe, but sharp if aimed correctly. I spent the next 2 days pulling together everything I had: copies of project postmortems, timeline breakdowns, client complaints, internal survey results, anything that could quantify the drop in performance that had followed Ryan's promotion. Luckily, people had been sending me things for months. Complaints, venting, desperate little updates that seemed harmless at the time, but now took on a whole new light. I wasn't collecting evidence back then, but now I had a pile of it. Enough to build a timeline, to show decline, to connect decisions to outcomes. But more importantly, I found the emails. Not the company ones; those had probably already been disabled the second I walked out, but the ones Harold and I had exchanged over the years, from our personal accounts, discussing long-term plans and concerns about succession. Most of it was general, cautious language. Harold had always been careful with words, but one thread stood out. It was dated about 2 years ago, right after Ryan had tried to eliminate the logistics department without realizing it would shut down 2 of our biggest contracts. Harold had written, "I may need to invoke 7.3.4 if he keeps moving like this. He's got energy, but no compass. I trust you'll know if the time comes." And right there in the next reply, I'd written back, "If it does, I'll act on it. Quietly." Quietly. That was the key. Ryan had assumed his move was clean because I hadn't raised hell. He didn't realize I had no intention of fighting him in the parking lot or screaming at HR. I was going to follow the rules, the very ones his father had put in place, because those rules were sharper than anything I could shout in a meeting. He thought this was personal. It wasn't. It was structural. With everything assembled, I contacted one person, Naomi Sinclair, the company's compliance officer and legal liaison to the board. Naomi and I had worked together during a vendor fraud audit 3 years prior, and while we weren't exactly friends, she respected the chain of logic. She didn't like drama, but she liked facts, and I had a folder full of them. I sent her a message. Section 7.3.4, attached documentation, request formal review per policy. She called me within the hour. Her tone was polite, clipped, like she was trying to keep emotion out of her voice. "John, I've reviewed your materials. This is substantial. If what you've documented holds under board review, the clause can be invoked. But you understand what this implies?" I did. It implied that I was about to challenge a sitting CEO, a founder's son no less, with nothing but an old clause and a mountain of receipts. It implied that I was walking into a corporate version of a knife fight, wearing a legal binder and a smile. I told her I understood. She said the board would need 7 business days to review. I asked if Harold had been notified. She said not yet, but that he would be. He was, after all, still the founder and largest shareholder. I could almost hear the pause on the other end. She was wondering if this was a vendetta or a rescue attempt. I didn't bother explaining, because she'd find out soon enough, and so would Ryan. The clause wasn't a weapon, it was a lever, and once I pulled it, there was no going back. When people imagine revenge, they think of dramatic confrontations in boardrooms, explosive firings, or some grand gesture where the underdog gets to slam the door on their way out. That's the Hollywood version, but the real kind of payback, the kind that actually works, is much slower. It's quiet. It requires patience, timing, and most of all, restraint. I didn't need to break anything. I just needed to let Ryan do what Ryan always did, make it worse. He'd been given enough rope the day his father handed him the keys, and now all I had to do was sit back and watch him tie the knots himself. The board review was underway. Naomi had confirmed that they'd meet in 10 days' time to evaluate the material I'd submitted, and until then, I was officially reactivated. Not in a public-facing role, but under the clause as an internal consultant with oversight access. That meant I could view operations logs, budget reports, employee surveys, and most importantly, leadership decisions impacting structure and performance. It was all above board, and none of it could be reversed unless Harold personally revoked the clause, which I knew he wouldn't. He hadn't spoken to me yet, but he'd seen the email trail, the performance decline, and the calls from board members asking whether his son was genuinely fit to lead. I didn't return to the office. That would have been too obvious. Instead, I logged in remotely, reading through internal systems, studying project logs and emails, and watching, in near real time, as the ship slowly began to list under Ryan's command. In just 6 weeks, he had managed to completely alienate 2 of our longest-standing clients, slash the budget for department training, and implement a hybrid work policy so confusing that HR had to send out 3 separate clarification memos, all of which contradicted each other. People were floundering, not because they were incompetent, but because the guy at the top kept yanking the wheel every 3 days without warning. Marketing had been told to pivot toward youthful branding, which translated into some painfully awkward ad campaigns that looked like they'd been written by a teenager who just discovered stock photos. Procurement had been restructured entirely, breaking long-term vendor relationships in favor of disruptive sourcing, which meant going with the cheapest suppliers who often didn't deliver on time. The warehouse staff, once one of the most stable arms of the business, had seen turnover spike by 30% due to the removal of overtime bonuses and the decision to implement a biometric time clock that regularly failed to register workers properly. And through it all, Ryan kept smiling for the internal newsletter photos, issuing vapid quotes like, "Change is uncomfortable, but so is growth," and "We're building a new Caldwell legacy." I watched him give interviews where he took credit for initiatives I had written 3 years ago. He stood on stage at a leadership summit and explained how the company's current agility was a product of fresh thinking and unconventional strategy, while behind the scenes we were bleeding staff and bleeding money. But I wasn't just watching. I was documenting. Every error had a paper trail. Every contradiction had a timestamp. Every ignored client warning. Every staff resignation citing toxic leadership. Every operational shortfall tied directly to Ryan's decisions. I logged it, organized it, and compiled it into a report that grew heavier by the hour. Naomi kept the board informed of my findings without editorializing. Just facts, clean and unavoidable. I didn't have to twist the truth. The truth was damning enough. Even the few people who had originally backed Ryan, those bright-eyed, LinkedIn-quoting middle managers he'd promoted quickly, began to second-guess their allegiance. Some started forwarding internal memos to me, documents that weren't just poorly thought out, but genuinely reckless. One outlined a plan to outsource our customer service team to a third-party firm overseas that had a reputation for upcharging and underdelivering. Another proposed eliminating the monthly safety audit in the warehouse, citing it as redundant, even though we'd had 2 near misses in the last quarter alone. Meanwhile, morale was circling the drain. I got messages from old colleagues who weren't even sure what was happening. They'd heard rumors, seen the leadership shuffle, noticed the uptick in board chatter, but none of them knew about the clause. No one had ever thought it would come into play. But the company had reached the point where people were leaving without giving notice, where clients were demanding someone other than Ryan be put in charge of their accounts, and where even the janitorial staff was openly speculating about when Harold might unretire. The day before the board meeting, I got a message from Lisa in procurement. It wasn't dramatic, just a 2-line email. "Don't know what's going on up there, but if you're involved, good. It's a mess." That was all I needed to know. By the time I finalized the report, it was nearly 70 pages long. Not a novel, not an exposé, just facts, neatly laid out, dated, attributed, cross-referenced, and supported by internal data. And it wasn't a hit job, it was an autopsy. And the cause of death wasn't incompetence, it was arrogance. Ryan had fired me thinking he was eliminating a threat to his control. What he didn't understand was that I was never after his job. I was trying to preserve the company, the one his father built, the one I helped run, the one that had fed families and paid college tuition, and meant something more than just share price and investor buzzwords. The review meeting had been scheduled for Monday at 9:00 a.m. I already knew what was going to happen, not because I had pulled any strings, but because Ryan had done the hard part for me. He'd hung himself. All I did was write the eulogy. The meeting was set for a Monday morning, 9 sharp, no video calls, no assistants, no fluff, just the full board, Harold Caldwell himself, Naomi Sinclair seated to his right, and one invited guest whose presence had been, according to the official wording, requested in an observational capacity, which was a polite and corporate-friendly way of saying that I had every right to be in that room, even though most people in it probably hoped I wouldn't show. But I did. I walked in wearing the same suit I'd worn the day Ryan fired me. Pressed, but lived in, with just enough wear around the cuffs to remind anyone looking that I'd earned my seat the hard way. The conference room hadn't changed. Not in the 2 months since I'd last been inside it. Not in the 10 years before that. Not since they installed those ridiculous hanging light fixtures that buzzed when the AC kicked on. The chairs were still too stiff. The projector still took forever to warm up. And the windows still gave a view of the same parking lot I used to stand in every morning with a coffee in one hand and a logistics checklist in the other. Some things didn't need to change, and frankly, a lot of them shouldn't have. That was the point. Ryan arrived 7 minutes late. No apology, no explanation, just a shrug, a smile, and some dumb comment about Monday traffic being a real bear, as if he hadn't just walked into a meeting that might determine the future of his career. He looked tired, but not nervous, like a kid who hadn't done the homework but figured he could still pass by, charming the substitute. He greeted the room with that same boardroom casualness he'd been weaponizing since the day he put on a nameplate, and then sat down directly across from me, either unaware or unwilling to acknowledge what was actually about to unfold. Harold didn't speak for the first few minutes, letting Naomi open the proceedings, which she did with her usual deliberate clarity. She summarized the clause, its purpose, its authority, its activation. She confirmed that the documentation submitted in support of the clause had been reviewed, verified, and considered by each board member present. She confirmed that the meeting's goal was not a vote of no confidence, but a formal assessment of executive leadership in accordance with the clause's stipulations, specifically in response to measurable operational disruption and potential fiduciary risk. When she finished, Harold finally leaned forward, both hands resting on the edge of the table, and looked directly at his son. There was no anger in his face, no fatherly scolding, no raised voice or personal bitterness. In fact, that was what made it worse. He looked at Ryan the same way he used to look at monthly numbers that didn't add up. Quietly disappointed, steadily analytical, and fully aware of the gap between what was promised and what was delivered. He said, "I gave you the keys because I believed you had the potential to lead with integrity and humility. What you've demonstrated instead is a desire to be seen leading without any understanding of what that actually means." Ryan tried to cut in, lifting a hand halfway like a teenager about to protest a detention, but Harold held up one finger and continued. "You've alienated our legacy clients, damaged internal cohesion, undermined department leads, and chased metrics you don't even seem to fully understand. I've reviewed the reports, all of them, from Naomi, from John, from the board, and from employees who've worked here longer than you've been alive. You are not being removed because of personality clashes. You are being reviewed because your leadership has become a liability to the organization." It was the first time anyone had put it in those words, flat on the table, like a ledger gone red. There was a long pause, the kind that fills every inch of a room, even though no one's moving, and then one of the board members, a quiet man named Gregory, who had never once raised his voice in a meeting, said, "I move that we suspend current executive authority pending independent audit and leadership restructuring." The rest followed suit, one by one, including a woman who had once been Ryan's biggest supporter. No shouting, no theatrics, just signatures and nods, like a tired courtroom finally delivering a sentence everyone saw coming. By the end of the hour, Ryan had been placed on administrative leave with conditions, stripped of daily operational control, and formally instructed to hand over all executive credentials to the board's appointed transition team. It was surgical, almost cold. No drama, no police escort, no media alert. Just a slow dismantling of power right in front of him. I expected him to explode, or at least to protest, but instead Ryan just sat there, face tight, lips pressed together, eyes flicking between Harold and me. Maybe he'd finally realized how far out of his depth he'd been the entire time. Or maybe he was too stunned to process that his father had just led the charge against him. Either way, he said nothing. The meeting adjourned. Chairs scraped the floor. Papers were collected. Naomi gave me a brief nod, professional but kind. And Harold, standing just behind her, walked over to me slowly. He didn't say thank you, and I didn't expect him to, but he looked me in the eye, the way he used to after a long shipping crisis was resolved or a vendor dispute got settled, and he gave me a nod. That was enough. That was his way of saying, "You did right by the company. You did what I couldn't." Later that week, I got a call from Naomi offering me a return. They wanted me to consider an interim role, not just as a consultant, but to help stabilize operations while the board worked through long-term restructuring. It was everything I'd been fighting for, handed back to me on a silver platter, minus the title and minus the man who had fired me, with a grin. I told her I'd think about it, then I hung up and sat there for a while, watching the sun go down behind my backyard fence, listening to the neighbor's kid bounce a basketball on the driveway. My wife came out and asked if I was okay. I said I was, because I was. I had done what needed doing, and not just for me, but for every person who still worked in that place, who still believed in what we had built before the branding consultants and executive retreats and empty slogans took over. But I also knew I didn't need to go back. I'd made my point. I'd protected what mattered. And sometimes the best way to move forward is to walk away while the building is still standing behind you, knowing it didn't collapse because you held the foundation steady when it mattered most.